So as we do on occasion, I wanted to take this Shabbat morning to take a look in a little bit more depth at this weekly Torah portion. It's really one of the most intense Torah portions emotionally that we can imagine. As we know, the Torah is generally reluctant to use words that are expressive of human emotion. Yes, there's a lot of language that's used that helps to express God's emotion, ironically, but typically very little that is used when we're talking about human beings. And this week, we have a number of interesting ideas that I think are part of the week. As I mentioned earlier, we find here the longest speech in the book of Bereshit, which is given by Yehuda. Now, what happens is when we read this, there's been a little bit back and forth. Joseph, the brothers, Jacob, famine, I'm going to leave one, I'm going to come back, here I'm going to come back more. I have to bring Benjamin, the youngest one, etc. It's a very, very intense time in the narrative of the Jewish people, of the Jewish family. And then we have also in this Parsha, we have the idea that Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. And recall that Yosef has risen to a position of command in Mitzrayim, and he does so, he says, Lo biladai ki Elohim, but not by myself, it's not because of anything that I did, but rather he attributes all of his success, which we've seen throughout his life from the time he leaves home when he's 17 years old. We see nothing but success after success, albeit with some setbacks, but he always seems to rise into a position of prominence. In this week's Torah portion, Vayigash love Yehuda, that what's going to happen is going to be a revealing of the brothers, their identity one to the other. It's going to create great emotion. And at the same time, we often think about Yosef himself and ask ourselves the question, what's going on in his mind? Is he sort of playing with his brothers? Is he trying to get revenge? Is he trying to prove to them that the dreams that he had as a youth, in fact, have come true? That character of Yosef is very tricky to understand. And what we find throughout the Parsha is the terminology of Achi, Abi, continuing to reference family. So even though Yosef has this position now of prominence in Egypt, and again recall that the Egyptians don't necessarily know that he's a Hebrew. Yes, they did earlier, but now that he's risen to this position of prominence, he's changed his name, he's changed his hairstyling, he's changed his clothing. Trust me, he doesn't look like a Jew. And in fact, we're told that there's an interpreter that is in place when the brothers come that is explaining. So I wanted to read what I found to be a very poignant description of Yosef and his inner turmoil that he is experiencing in this Parsha. And this is written by a biblical scholar named Leon Cass. So I just wanted to share this with you because I found it very moving, and I have the pulpit. So Joseph, the brothers, it says the following. Joseph, still present, hears, and unbeknownst to his brothers, understands all of their confessional talk. They had failed to hear him when he besought them from the pit. But he hears them and his earlier self in their distress. Just as his speech had uncorked their guilty memories, so their remarks revive his painful memories. But these familial memories and emotions are now overshadowed by cultural complications, economically but beautifully conveyed in the seemingly inconsequential remark about the interpreter. Joseph, unbeknownst not only to his brothers, but also to his Egyptian entourage, speaks and understands both Egyptian and Hebrew. His brother's distressing conversation, he thus hears twice, first in Hebrew as spoken by the brothers, then in Egyptian when translated by the interpreter. Nothing could better convey the struggles taking place in Joseph's soul. Do I belong with them? Or do I belong with Egypt? No wonder he loses his composure. He weeps, probably with recalled terror and sadness for the previous episode, perhaps with genuine pleasure for their remorse, but very likely also with the, at best, bittersweet knowledge that he is still bound to them and must somehow return to them. Joseph is painfully reminded of his place in this family, a place that he himself once coveted, but a long time ago, a place that he lost, and a place which he is now at best ambivalent. Much as Joseph would like to turn away from them, simply cannot do so. Very, very powerful message about Yosef as a character. Sort of reminds me a little bit, let's sort of get some people's reactions. What do you think about this character Yosef? He's about to reveal himself to his brothers. Any thoughts about what he might be going through? What are the brothers going through? What are the Egyptians who are witnessing this going through? Any comments?
I think the brothers are all nervous. They don't know what's going on. They might think that this man is going to kill them, not knowing the situation.
Right, and in fact, he has said to them, unless you do what I say, I'm not going to give you food, you won't see my face again, etc. Joseph was very aggressive with them in the previous meeting. Pearl.
Well, I think he's grown, lives in Egypt. Family is still very important to him. And he's got, he's not choosing, but he has two sons now. He's got this Egyptian that gave him all this wealth and whatever. And yet family, how does he choose?
So
It's a difficult emotional feeling for him.
right, and I think we're talking about a dual identity. Myra. Right.
So I think that's too much exaggeration for his being at his study, because that 20 years passed and didn't bother to find out if his father is alive or what happened with them.
They didn't have telephones.
So it's a real.
Cell phones.
But it was,
So it is a question that was last week that it's been now 22 years, whatever the case may be. And Yosef certainly hasn't written home. We know that, right? So has he left behind his family? And if he did so, is it understandable? Right? But the family always comes back. David.
He's also going through some other turmoil. And that turmoil is he has all the Egyptians to leave him. He doesn't want to reveal himself in front of the Egyptians. That's when he starts to cry and say, I'm your brother. And then the sentence, the pasuk goes on, and that Pharaoh heard of all this.
Yes.
He does not know what the outcome will. He loses power now.
Right. So Joseph, thank you. So Yosef he's balancing this weird dual identity, if you will. And I think the pasuk that you're quoting, it says they love a Paro that comes her to the house of Paro after they have their own interchange with the brothers. Now Pharaoh hears about it. So what is going to happen to, by the way, Joseph, right? He's an outsider. as much as thinks he's integrated into this system, and yes, he saves Egypt, but we know that come a couple of weeks, you come back in 2 weeks, it's like Asher lo yoda et Yosef, right? So he's probably trembling also. Yes.
Very complicated. Joseph holds all the power and he's deciding how to regulate everything. He decided that he wants some kind of forgiveness. He wants to forgive his brothers. He wants the whole situation to change. He wants a relationship with his family. And he doesn't want to go back to the anguish and the anger of having been given away. So he's really controlling what's going on. But he's also bringing in the brothers into this new sentiment that he has. He's not excluding them.
That's fair, and he would have had every right to, one could argue. And by the way, his character thus later becomes antithetical to the Pharaoh, continues to harden his heart, right? And so here's Yosef specifically doing the opposite, right? So that's an interesting contrast in itself. Idea of being in part that Yosef can't be whole until there's some type of a resolution, right? And that has to do with his personal identity, it has to do with his family dynamics. I used the expression before, I said, if you don't want to have a heart attack, don't read this Parsha, right? Because there's so many, there's news that comes in. Take a look quickly with these two psukim. I'm on page 275. At the bottom. Well, chapter 45, but look at how Yosef, there's been this back and forth, right? Yehuda has already given a speech imploring him to Yosef to show kindness to the brothers. Keeping in mind, interestingly, that this is the place, many argue in the text, where Yehuda, right, will become the forebearer of the kingdom of Judah, right, really usurps the place of the firstborn, right? We see that throughout Genesis, but we don't see it as prominently in the story of Yaakov's descendants. We say to ourselves, Abraham has two children. Who are his two children? Abraham is Yitzhak and Ishmael. By the way, so Ishmael was born first, Yitzhak, the covenant continues through fun. So find the Seder to the second born, right? Should also know that interesting observation that in many ways the story of Genesis is a story about continual loss times two, I would argue. What does that mean? So Abraham actually loses two sons. How so? How does he lose Ishmael? That's the way, right? He's not a child, right? And he is told, perhaps by Sarah as the protagonist through God, it's got to get rid of Ishmael. By the way, he also, right after the Akedah, loses Yitzhak. Right? They never speak again in the Bible. According to most calculations, Yitzhak is 37 years old when the Akedah takes place, and 150 when he dies. That's a long time not to speak to your kid. Right? So he loses twice. That's Abraham. Yitzhak also loses twice. Who does he lose? Right? Yitzhak has two sons, Esau and Yaakov. Right? Right? So how does he lose? Yaakov is clear. Yaakov runs away from home. His brother's going to kill him. He loses him, right? And Yaakov is then going to be serving Laban for another 20 years or something, right? So Yitzhak is going to lose Yaakov. He also loses Esau because Esau intermarries and moves out into the interland. So they have that. So again, it's double loss for Abraham. It's double loss for Yitzhak. And now there's a double loss that Yaakov is potentially facing, which is, of course, the loss of Yosef, right? And then potentially, and this is what he's worried about, having seen the pattern, he's worried about the loss of Binyamin. He sends Binyamin down. So the one who steps in place and is able to to help guide this is Yehudah, becomes the central figure, not Reuven, not the oldest, but Yehudah. So why Yehudah? Interesting. People argue that if you think about Yehudah, he is not the most righteous character in the Bible either, right? Yehudah, you'll recall, has 3 sons, 2 of whom died. That's the double loss. I think there's this theme of a double loss that central characters in Genesis face. He then fails the test with his daughter-in-law, Tamar, in terms of doing equal marriage with the 3rd son, Shem. But there's a double loss that follows all of these characters in Genesis. So as I look at 45:1, it says, "V'lo yachol Yosef lehidaber," he couldn't even control himself. L'kol hanitzavim alav, everybody who's standing in front of him, but he cries and he calls out. He doesn't say, calls out. What does he say? Oh, see you call each man alive. Everybody get away from me. Below Abadish Ito, and there's nobody standing with him. The Hitvadah, Yosef El Echad. The Hitvadah, when Yosef makes himself known to his brothers. And can you imagine what's going through this? Is he going to kill us? Is he angry? Has he forgiven us? Are we in trouble? It's unbelievable. But he cries out. But Yishmael Mitzrayim, Yishma Beit Paro. Then all of a sudden Egypt hears. And then Beit Paro hears. And as David pointed out to us, what kind of a precarious position does that put Yosef? Right? And he asked the question that you recognize. Yosef and Yosef. And Yosef. And he asks the question that matters to him, that if we call Shlomo Karlabach makes a famous song out of. And he says the following, Od Avi Kai. Od Avinu Kai. That's where he took it from, this biblical passage. Is my father still alive? And if you're sensitive to the text, what he's not asking, that means our father is still alive. My father, yes.
I would suggest that his concern is his obligation, not the brothers are just angry.
Beautiful. Right, so we'll find a shift in the language. He does typically uses the term avi, but he'll also use the term avinu. But it's a great point that Yosef, perhaps Yosef is, if you will, one could argue, post-brotherhood concern. His only concern, obviously, is Benjamin as the remaining son. But that term of avi, perhaps he doesn't really care about the brothers. Fair enough. Yes. Sue, did you have something?
I just find it amazing that Joseph forgives the brothers so easily. It's just what they did to him was so horrific. Even though all's well that ends well, still in all, they were going to kill him, then they sold him, then they ransomed.
Well, they abused him also, right? By tearing off his clothes, throwing him in a pit. I mean, terrible, right?
And then when it comes to forgiving, he says, all right, I forgive you.
Yeah, but
how many years later?
Yeah, then he was like, oh,
Okay, so he did, I think Yosef is a testament to the possibility of change in profession. Go.
Well, I was gonna say that, in reading the translation, it says that, it's like he has this realization that what they did was really just fulfilling God's will for him.
Right, and God bless him for his spirituality, right? Don't worry, this is great, this is what God wanted for me. He sent me down, I'm gonna make everything nice, it'll be nice, right? And I love it as a, it's an interesting question. You and I had spoken about this earlier this week, about this idea of what happens if you really truly have a spiritual or religious orientation and how you perceive life about you. So can you give us 30 seconds on your situation earlier this week?
very briefly,
Please.
a humongous tree split and fell into my house, on my house, right on the room where I sleep.
Right, that's why Sue made your Patagome. I was speaking to her earlier this week, and you know, I love Sue, she's a very nice woman. So I love Sue, and she said to me, you know, how blessed I am from Hashem that tree didn't fall a few inches further to the other side, right? And what a great way to see that as opposed to, oh my goodness, the damage, the this, the that. So having a spiritual orientation really can affect how we see things in the world. Let me share with you one other pasuk, okay? I want to go to page 279, verse 25, and 45:25. And this is the part where it's, if there's one place you don't want to be in the position of these brothers. Guaranteed. Why? By Yalu Mitzrayim, they come up from Egypt. They have now a royal invitation to return with their father, etc., etc. Vayoho Eretz Canaan, the brothers come to Eretz Canaan. El Yaakov Aviem. They come back to their father, right? Vayagiru Lo Lemor. And now, guess what? They have to tell him what happened with Yosef. Think about that for a minute. They concocted a story, abused and sold their brother, presumably left for dead, then made up another piece of the story, went out of their way to dip blood on the coat, bring it back to the brother, and watch their father sit Shiva by himself. They don't participate. And now they say the following to the father: Od Yosef Ha, your son is alive. And I was thinking to myself, first of all, beside the obvious analogies that we can use with the situation in Israel, God willing, everybody should be perfect. But can you imagine actually having gone through that process of mourning for a relative and then finding out that they're still alive? And when I said I was in part Kibitzing, you know, Yaakov is an older man at this point. It's not as if the brother say, Dad, sit down, we want to talk to you about something. You know, Dad, and go into something, no, you'll say fine, right? He's alive. Think about how, in fact, almost cruel that is. But maybe it was simply that, right? The trees had to come out. And you can't, however you flower your speech, whatever, they had to say what had happened. Now, the Midrash says, by the way, that Yaakov would have and should have had a heart attack, except for the following situation. Was that Sarah Bat Asher, which is his granddaughter, as many of you know, she was an accomplished musician. And she was playing the harp outside of her tent. When she sees the entourage coming up from Mitzrayim, she recognized what's happened. And she started to sing a song that said, Joseph is still alive. And Yaakov hears that from the tent, and therefore when the boys come and tell him, he isn't as shocked as we might have expected. So I want to leave you with the following thought. We do have this idea, ultimately, of Hine Matom Panai Shevta Hine Yaakov, that there has to be a resolution in some way, shape, or form. We live in a world of fractured relationships, and we learn to live with them often, but I don't think we necessarily experience shleimut, fulfillment, if those situations aren't resolved. And it's something for us to think about, not only in our family relationships, but also how we interact with other Jewish people, something to think about globally, obviously. And I will conclude by suggesting that ultimately, right, we find shalom as, remember where it says, Ohev shalom ve'rodev shalom. You can love peace and fulfillment and contentment as much as you want. But we also have to be rotated, that it has to be an active process on our part. And sometimes we try, and we try, and we try again, and sometimes it doesn't work. And what the Torah teaches us in part is rotate, try, and try again. And ultimately, shalom.